Good afternoon from the magnificent Istanbul, where East meets West. This city has served as the capital of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and it's the only city divided not by a river, but by the sea, where people commute regularly between continents. As a former culture capital of Europe and sports capital of Europe as well, Istanbul also bears solutions for our common security policies. Addressing security concerns have become more challenging, and there is a clear need to rebuild solidarity and security mechanisms. The transatlantic security architecture is built mainly on NATO, which rebuilds itself in the light of regional and global developments. Changing warfare techniques such as cyber attacks or hybrid threats have increased the urgency of adaptability to new problems without compromising from our common values. Yes, we can cite many examples which had damaging effects on the confidence of the alliance, such as the critical vote of the Turkish parliament on March 1st of 2003, which misled our strategic ally to cooperate with wrong partners, such as YPG, PKK, and FETÖ. Labeling the most important alliance as brain-dead was yet another grave mistake which boosted the confidence of NATO's opponents. The late and very limited response to the annexation of Crimea was yet another example. I can go on and on with such examples. However, our need and dependability on NATO is more vital than ever before. As we move towards the Vilnius summit, we realize that the war in Ukraine has reinforced our solidarity. NATO's deterrence and defense posture is strengthened. Turkey's call for the appointment of a special coordinator for counterterrorism has finally more support than ever before. Increasing NATO's footprint in Black Sea and enlarging the alliance are examples of the 360 degrees approach for wider vision. Today, we will discuss all these issues with very prominent panelists. Our first esteemed speaker is Dr. Nicola Pedde, Director of the Institute for Global Studies based in Rome and Brussels. Dr. Pedde has served as Director of Research for the Middle East at the Italian Military Center for Strategic Studies and as a political advisor for the Italian Ministry of Defense. Our second esteemed speaker is Professor Paolo von Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on building international consensus on issues of security, trade, development, and energy. Professor Schirach also teaches political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University in Washington, D.C., where I had been a guest in 2013, 10 years ago. In addition, he is the founder and editor of the Schirach Report, an online publication focusing on politics, economics, and international security. Professor Schirach also has been a frequent lecturer at the Foreign Service Institute, the U.S. federal government's primary foreign affairs training institution. Our next speaker is soon-to-be ambassador, Deputy Director General Volkan Öskiper, who has held various high-level security affairs positions as a career officer in the Foreign Ministry of my beloved country. Mr. Öskiper has served as the director, at the General Directorate for Multilateral Political Affairs and has worked as disarmament and arms control counselor at the UN office in Geneva. He has also served as the head of the OSCE Arms Control and Disarmament Division and was later appointed to NATO as the Turkish Defense Counselor. Between 2018 and 2019, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy in Baku, and now serves as Deputy Director General for NATO and Euro-Atlantic Security and Defense Affairs. And our final speaker is Professor Luís Tomé, who serves as the Director of International Relations Department at Autonomous University of Lisbon. Professor Tomé has served as a Special Advisor for International Relations and Counterterrorism in the Office of the Ministry of Home Affairs, as well as Special Advisor to Vice President of the European Parliament. Now, let me give them a chance to share their preliminary thoughts on transatlantic security architecture. I would appreciate if they could limit their first round comments to 5 minutes and share their forecasts for the war in Ukraine as well. We will have a second, if possible, a third round before taking questions from the audience. Thank you very much, and I am asking Dr. Pedde to be the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure in Istanbul. Well, I would like to spend my first round of minutes commenting something related to strategic autonomy. And in particular, well, I agree with what you said, that the war in Ukraine demonstrated cohesion, has reinforced the posture of NATO and the cohesion among NATO member states. On the other side, I am a little bit skeptic on the ongoing debate over strategic autonomy, at least all over Europe. What does it mean? What this debate is focusing on? And what I fear is that it's a little bit misleading to a certain extent and confusing, because when we talk about strategic autonomy, very often we refer to an autonomy from what? In particular from our primary ally, the United States. And well, we have seen it, for example, during last August 2021 and during the evacuation of Kabul. There was an ongoing huge debate over its autonomy, and at the end of the day, we discussed for several years. We started in 2003 in Helsinki discussing about the need of let's say, establishing a 50, 60,000 strong rapid reaction force. And at the end of the day, we ended up in Kabul with difficulty in putting together 5,000 soldiers from our own side. So the concept of strategic autonomy, it's in my opinion not obsolete or wrong per se. It has just to be reframed probably, and we should think about a major integration of individual labor with the US rather than looking for autonomous strategies and autonomous idea of what we mean for strategic autonomy. The overambitions projections of the European capacities outside of NATO traditional sphere of influence and interest could be almost certainly ineffective in this way, and probably even too much expensive and detrimental for the definition of a proper defense capability. At the same time, the definition of a more clear and structured set of objectives could be helpful in shaping a new posture which could be much more effective as it is needed, for example, in the case of the Ukrainian crisis, and created a more solid infrastructure. And in this sense, I think that the US are welcoming this idea. Are welcoming the idea of a more balanced capacity from NATO members, a more, let's say, sound strategy which is refocusing on priorities, especially on the European side of NATO.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Paolo von Schirach, how does the same concept look when you approach the issues from the other side of the Atlantic?
Am I on? Yes, thank you. Okay. Well, I had some slides, but I guess they will come maybe at another moment. So let me just try to address this point, Mr. Moderator. Thank you. But it's not that, I'm not quite sure how this works. This is not my presentation. This is somebody else's presentation.
So,
never mind.
So, you can use it.
Never mind. So why don't we just carry on, unless they can put it on, because I see this is the other gentleman. So I would like to step back for a moment because we're talking about policies, intentions, direction, priorities, etc. And we forget, sadly, the underlying juice that makes everything work, which is money. Money. We ran out of it. Let me be very frank. There is a debate now in the United States, if you watched even, the news this morning, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America has made a kind of a very somber announcement that the United States is on the verge of bankruptcy because the Republican opposition that now controls the House of Representatives in the United States federal government and the White House cannot agree on a plan to cut spending, federal spending that is, as they need to vote for an increase in the debt ceiling for the national debt. Oh, this sounds terribly complicated, but it means that without congressional authorization, the United States government has no authority to spend money. And if it doesn't spend money, it goes bankrupt. Just like that. And this will be a month from now. And at the moment, there is no agreement whatsoever on how to do this. But this is just one, not even half of it, because the Republicans, who are now controlling the House of Representatives, want to have some meaningful spending cuts in the federal budget, but they don't address the real big-ticket items in federal spending, which is welfare programs in the United States. And you can say, well, what's got to do with anything, this? It has to do enormously with this. The United States has become a welfare state, just like other European countries, and as a result of that, defense spending is being squeezed out. In other words, the United States now spends on defense about 3% of GDP, which is less than half the average of the Cold War. We are now at the point that we have reduced dramatically our defense industrial base. The United States have 4 shipyards that produce Navy ships. Our air wings are half of what they used to be. Our Navy is less than 300 ships, and on and on. So where am I going with all this? That in order to have policies, you need to have capabilities. And in order to have capabilities, you need budgets. And the money is just not there anymore. You can say, oh, come on, this is preposterous. The United States spent $800 billion on defense. Are you telling me that's not enough? Yes, I'm telling you that's not enough. I give you just a simple data point. To operate a carrier group, which is the backbone of the United States Navy, it costs $6.5 million a day. A day. This is what it costs. To buy a carrier is $13 billion. To buy an F-35, which is the prize of, the pride of the U.S. Technology, the best, air superiority fighter jet in the history of military aviation, it costs $80 million a piece. To operate, it costs $30,000 an hour. In other words, we are now at a point of significantly reduced military capabilities for lack of budgetary authority. And considering that the priorities of the United States as a nation are to spend more money on welfare rather than defense, I don't see any inflection point. So, that said, and I'm trying to be brief here, has the United States an answer to the current geopolitical threats, particularly the war in Ukraine? The answer is no. Can the United States provide the Ukrainians the operational capabilities to create an offensive force to defeat Russia? The answer is no. Not because of lack of political will, because we don't have it. Recent agreements between the United States and Ukraine in providing additional military aid to the Ukrainian forces, which the United States has done significantly, says, and I quote, these weapon systems will be provided to Ukraine in the next, and I quote, few years. Not months, not next spring, few years. Why? Because we don't have them, and we cannot make them. Sounds incredible? No, it's not. The defense industrial base in the United States has shrunk to a minimum. We have only 2 companies that can produce military airplanes. That's Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and that's that. So it is a rather somber environment in which we are, in which the United States now has piled up because of unwise fiscal policies and extra money spent. I mean, when I say extra money, I mean trillions of dollars that have been spent during the pandemic. The national debt of the United States is now $31 trillion. And that's trillion. $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And that's the fiscal situation of the United States right now. And there is absolutely nothing that I can see in the foreseeable future that will provide, a reprieve from this, which is to say the United States now is at a point in which is unable to deliver on the policies that it would like to implement for lack of means.
Thank you. Your rather pessimistic approach reminded me of Churchill, who said, Americans always do the right thing after exploiting all the other options. But let's hear a Turkish perspective from Deputy Director General Öskiper. How do you see what's going on around our globe?
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. I had very optimistic thoughts before hearing the professor. If he hasn't done this to relieve us all of the heaviness of the beautiful lunch we had just had, then there's a problem. There's this famous 3 C's in NATO: cash, capabilities, and contributions. Cash is a problem for all, the magnitude of which is very worrisome now, hearing from the professor. NATO allies, before the 24th of February of last year, let's say mid-January, when NATO Council would meet, we would have all different sorts of ideas, 3-4 different camps of thoughts in the minds of NATO allies on where this was going. Even when the US was sharing very credible intelligence that the war was going to begin, there were allies which would say no, no. And then on the 24th, the war began, and there was a council on the 24th and the 25th. All allies got together all of a sudden, leaving aside the political expediencies or differences of opinions on where this was going, what Russia was doing, what Ukraine was doing, and this and that. And we are still hanging on to that solidarity a year and some after the war. Of course, solidarity is good and needed and indispensable, if you will, but it is, at the end of the day, just rhetoric, unless you manage to show it. And NATO allies are already, for a long time now, discussing how to sustain the help we give to Ukraine. The amount of howitzers, just to name one weapon system, that the Ukrainian armed forces is burning a day is incredible. Incredible, and this is going to take more effort than we are doing at this stage for all of us to continue to sustain our help to Ukraine. You asked, Ambassador, what we think where this war is going. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't think anyone does. But we know where this must go. We must continue to support Ukraine. We must continue to engage with the Russians and tell them what the expectations of the other side are, and try to find a way that would create a modus operandi while the war is on, and somehow manage to set the scene for an architecture, a security architecture, once the war ends. The war will end, all wars end, this will end, of course, hopefully the way most of the world wants. But we will have Russia where it is now when the war ends. There are certain countries who tend to see this war as the chance to get Russia on its knees, do away with Russia once and for all. It's not going to happen. And this is not NATO's war, this is not US's war, this is not our war. This is a war we are living through, let's say, which is not the best of English that I can find now. Cash may be running low. Capabilities will run low, are running low already. Contributions is one area that NATO allies can do more. When I say contributions, not only contributions to NATO missions and operations, but contributions to oneself. Not all allies are as resilient as they must be. And NATO is somehow a political military alliance, but it is, I would say, the weakest side of NATO is that it is as strong as its weakest link, let's say. And there are weak links, particularly when there is a war, and as Ambassador rightly said, the first war in a long time in Europe, a conventional war with a nuclear twist. I think we allies must be as resilient as we can, given the budgetary strains and implications that we all feel. A word or two on Professor Pedde's strategic autonomy. I think this is a very, the word choice, autonomy, is not right. The EU sees the strategic autonomy as the capability to be able to undertake collective defense by itself, on its own, without the US, without NATO. This is not the world we do this. This is a world where we get together and join forces and try as hard as we can to do away with duplications rather than help or contributions from others. I think there's a tendency in the minds of some to see strategic autonomy as strategic monopoly, if you will, which is not true, because this is exactly when we need NATO and the EU to cooperate in a genuine fashion, leaving aside the narrow political expectations of certain EU members. I think I would leave it at that without abusing my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good timing. Professor comes from a beautiful city which I think resembles Istanbul a lot. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the global challenges from Lisbon, do they resemble the fears that people in Istanbul have, or do you have a totally different set of agenda as you approach these global challenges?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Allow me to begin by thanking for the invitation and greeting all the colleagues of this panel and all the participants. But I have some comments from the previous presentations, but I first like to underline an idea. And the idea is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine represents a rupture in the post-Cold War era and the beginning of a new era in which Putin's Russia is recognized as the main threat to European security and stability. But there is another consequence, a changing geopolitical map of Europe. The demarcation line between Russia and Ukraine will define not only their common border, but also the border between Europe and Russia, the European Community and the Eurasian Bloc, and the Transatlantic Alliance, and the Russia-China axis. The line of demarcation must be as stable as the line dividing Germany and Europe during the Cold War, which prevented the rise to extremes between the Transatlantic Alliance and the Soviet Empire for 40 years. The third consequence is the changing positions of the major European powers. UK, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and so on, their strategies and relations among them. the traditional divide between Atlanticists and Europeanists is no longer relevant. I think we could say now, remembering Bill Clinton, it's geopolitics, stupid. The fourth consequence is the changing in the post-Cold War European security architecture. Putin's Russia was excluded itself from the Euro-Atlantic community. It violates not only the UN Charter, but also the Helsinki Act, the European Security Charter, and the European Convention on Human Rights. Russia was excluded of the Council of Europe after 26 years of membership. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is moribund. The other 7 members of the Arctic Council suspended cooperation with Russia. Now all areas of relationship have been securitized. Russian aggression against Ukraine has been a transformative moment for the EU, forcing wrenching change on energy, economic, and security policy. The EU's decoupling from Russia, oil and gas, ends 50 years of connectivity and mutually beneficial energy relations. The NATO Founding Act and the NATO-Russian Council no longer have a raison d'etre. Sweden and Finland abandoned their historical neutrality to join NATO. And if Sweden's entry is also confirmed soon, of the 27 EU member states, only 4, Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus, are not part of NATO. The EU has opened its doors to Ukraine and Moldova, as well to the Western Balkan states. The fifth change is the nascent, we could call it Atlantic Pacific. That is the expansion of geopolitical and security ties between the Euro-Atlantic and the Asia-Pacific regions. In June last year, the 4 Asia-Pacific partners, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Republic of Korea, participated for the first time in a NATO summit. And the then approved NATO's new strategic concept expressly mentions China as a challenge and that the Indo-Pacific is important for NATO. The EU is operationalizing its 2021 strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And there is also new joint development of military capabilities, such as the Global Combat Air Program between Japan, UK, and Italy, the first one that Japan develops with partners other than the US. In addition to these changes, that's the other points on the other rounds, the recoding of the transatlantic security architecture also depends on the position of the so-called Global South that we are losing, and Europe's relations with the US and China. A final word on strategic autonomy of Europe and the European Union. The question is, usually we are using the term on Europe's and the EU vis-à-vis the US. But now I think we start thinking in 2 different senses as well. Vis-à-vis China and Europe being a 3rd major power, not to be squashed between China and the US, because we are living in a world, not a multipolar world, but a bi-multipolar world. And if Europe wants to have a voice, wants to have a say in this new world, the strategic autonomy, not only on defense, in all broad sense of strategy, needs to be the 3rd big power, not be squashed between China and the West.
Thank you. In the first round, Professor Schirach gave a very compelling new argument about financing. And you mentioned that we are out of money. But we know that in a global world, money is also a relative resource which helps us compete with our opponents. Does the opponents of the transatlantic security challenge have more money than we do? I'll be more specific. Do you think Russia, China, and all the others mentioned in the discussion are in a better off condition to challenge our capabilities? And I'll ask the same question to other panelists as well, but I'll start with you since you posed this argument.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellent question. I would pose it a little bit different. Do we have the resources that prevent us to make China the world hegemon? That's the question. It's not so much that whether China has more money than we have. China seems to have more staying power because the Chinese Communist Party is able to commandeer the entire national economy at its own services. They can do pretty much whatever they want. They own all the banks. They own a very large number of state-owned enterprises, energy, construction, gas and oil, whatever. And the private sector in China essentially does not exist as such. It exists only to the extent that the Chinese Communist Party allows it to continue if they conform to the mission that is assigned to them. So the question is America capable, with its allies, capable of preventing China from becoming the world hegemon? Do we have enough resources? It's not so much that China has to have much more money than the United States, which it does, by the way, right now. China can rely on a few $1 trillion of reserves. The United States has a federal budget, a national debt of $31 trillion, by the way, some of which, a significant percentage, owned by China, among others. So are we in a position right now to successfully prevent, and I would use an old-fashioned word invented by George Kennan in 1947, contain China? The answer is, I'm not sure. If China can continue on its trajectory of spreading slowly but surely its influence, not just in its immediate proximity. Take notice of the fact that the Chinese are now controlling the entire South China Sea, and nobody has made a peep about that. That's completely illegal, completely against any principle of international law, and so what? Every war game that I have seen indicates that in any confrontation over Taiwan, we lose, because we don't have force projection to prevent the Chinese to take over Taiwan. We just don't have it. The United States fleet has 285 vessels. The Chinese Navy has 340. Okay? This is today. And the mission of the Chinese Navy when it comes to take over Taiwan is much more, it's much easier because they operate close to their shores. So I'm saying this has to be taken contextually. Now, in the long term, who has more staying power? The West, with all its problem, of China in its, and Russia, for that matter, in their own contradictions of being autocracies that have to commandeer resources which in the end are also limited. Who knows? But I would say that a superpower that's run out of money is no longer a superpower. And look at, I don't know, if we want a historic example, the Spanish Empire didn't end because Spain was defeated in major battles. They just ran out of money. They became poor. And therefore, they couldn't manage to hold on to their overseas territories and whatnot. And this is the destiny of many other major powers that simply run out of resources enough to be able to allow them to project force where they would have wanted to. So my answer is, it's kind of complicated, but in terms of preventing the two major autocracies of the world, which are now in a close alliance, and if you want to add Iran to this lovely group, and North Korea, maybe that's another, addition to the family. But the reality is that there is not much that the United States at this point can do, essentially certainly not on its own, to prevent the further expansion of the reach of the autocracies. And if Russia is a problem because it's on the front pages because we have a war, China is 100 times worse.
Thank you for your interesting comments. Dr. Pedde, I have a question for you. Where is Europe in all of this? We're talking about our strategic ally, the largest power of NATO, according to Dr. Schirach, going bankrupt. China and Russia having more means. But the grandest peace project of the history of mankind, which has ensured peace on the continent, full of historical war. Where is European Union in all of this as a force? can EU be an impediment against other global challenges?
Well, it's difficult to say where Europe is in this moment, and if Europe is still united in terms of global strategy. We see several different European approaches, for sure. There is, in this moment, at least a group of driving forces from the East, which are pushing on a certain policy. There are continental Europeans from the center and the Mediterranean, which are probably trying to defend a European vision which is not only related to the threat coming from the East, and on that I would like to follow on what also our colleague from Lisbon was saying, that one probably elements which is visible at a European level is that despite the agreement on the new security framework crafted by the new strategy of NATO, there is a missing point, which is the southern threat, the ongoing threat coming from the south, which for certain European countries is perceived as intense and as dangerous as the one coming from Russia, from China, and from the East. There is a feeling in certain countries, and certainly Italy is one of these, that there is not enough attention to what's going on the south, and that the defense of Europe and the defense of NATO in future could be challenging for most of the European countries because of the lack of capabilities in coping with these emerging threats coming from the south. And this is creating a certain kind of instability, I think, within the overall European debate. Where is better to invest? Which are the priorities for the future? And certainly the Ukrainian war, it's absorbing a lot of energies in this moment, and it's correct. We have to do our part. We have to invest in defending Ukraine in this phase, but is the Ukrainian war the beginning of a new world where major crisis will be again driven by symmetrical warfare, or is the last of the symmetrical war that we'll have to fight in future? That's the big question mark, I think, most of the Europeans are considering in this moment. And if we look at the kind of threat we are still facing from the south, the vast majority of the threat is asymmetrical, still asymmetrical. And it's a huge geographical dimension, which is, I don't even want to say on the brink of explosion, because probably it's already exploded. Sahel, it's exploded in terms of potential of crisis. North Africa is paying the consequence of this, and we are facing many different crises which requires different capabilities from both NATO and, more in general, European let's say, capability of response. So the Ukrainian crisis, it's in this moment absorbing most of these energies within the European debate, but still I think that there is an ongoing and very intense debate on what's next, what it will be the future of our engagement, what it will be the future of our, in terms of definition of our capabilities for the futures. And if we look at this in terms of future scenarios, I think that the southern flanks, it's where we see, at least in part of the, at least in the Central European Union perspective, I think that it's where we see the vast majority of the coming threat. And even talking about Russia and China, I think that we will confront Russia and China more and more in Africa and in the Middle East rather than in other areas from a European perspective. I'm quite skeptical that the Europeans will be able to project in the Indo-Pacific a significant capacity to provide security and to provide a real capability to the US and NATO more in general.
Yeah, thank you. I want to come back to Professor Tomé. You also reminded us about the NATO summit where Asia-Pacific countries attended for the first time. How do you see the upcoming challenges ahead of us? Do you think NATO is prepared for a crisis in the Pacific if needed?
No.
Yep. No? Are you?
Yeah.
Okay. No, NATO is not the proper organization. It is for political articulation. But I don't agree with Professor Paolo von Schirach when he only mentions money. It is not only a matter of money. We spend a lot more money than Russia. Just Europe spends the double than Russia spends in defense. NATO Europe spends more than China on defense. If we put together all our military capabilities, including the nuclear ones, we have unbeatable. The problem is a lack of a political goal and a lack of strategy. President Biden is an anti-President President Trump. Trump was an anti-Obama. Obama was an anti-W. Bush. W. Bush was an anti-Clinton. And not to mention in Europe. If we ask the European leaders and US leadership, what is the goal in Ukraine? What is your goal in 10 years from now? We see a lot of different answers. But we know what are the political goals of China in Ukraine. Avoid the downfall of Putin. He needs Putin. China needs a reliable ally in their continental border because the priority of China is the maritime front, South and East China Sea and Taiwan. The second is to have a say on the peace process and the eventual peace agreement on Ukraine, and to have a say on economic and security, new European architecture after war. And the third is to promote the global ambitions to create a new world order with Chinese characteristics. We know what are the Chinese goals. We don't know what are European goals or the US goals. Then there is a huge mistake that Dr. Pedde said that we are constructing. We are forgetting the global South. This narrative, democracies versus autocracies, have no sense at all. It's not real. It is not real. Just look, for instance, the votes on the UN, 5 resolutions voted concerning Russia aggression against Ukraine. We have a lot of democracies abstaining, at least in one of the resolutions. There's several major democracies abstaining in all 5 resolutions. There was a survey from the European Council on Foreign Relations in 9 EU countries and 6 other countries, and show that Europe and the US are united, considering Russia as a rival and an adversary. But in Turkey, or India and China, for more than 70% of the population think that Russia is a necessary partner or a necessary ally. It is Turkey a democracy? Of course it is. And India, and Brazil, and Pakistan, and India, and South Africa. So we are losing the global south. We are living in a world where there are a lot more sovereign countries with their own interests than the US and European, and we need to look to the south, to the global south. It is not a matter of money. It is a matter of an understanding world we live in, to have proper goals and to have a proper strategy. For instance, we are now discussing the future. What is the future of the transatlantic relations if Donald Trump wins the next election next year? Again, this is a huge impact on transatlantic relations. So money is needed, but we need to have common goals and a common strategy, including for the Indo-Pacific. The European countries, maybe a little bit France, a little bit UK, have some military capabilities to do something in the Indo-Pacific. But the question is, why in the following day the same US president says we will not fight as NATO in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a NATO member. It is a sovereign country with recognized international borders, but we will not fight Russia because of Ukraine. And the following day, he said, if China attacks Taiwan, that US do not recognize as a sovereign country, the US will fight China. Why? How can we understand this? Is this coherent? We know why the US president is saying this. I understand. And of course, we cannot be indifferent if China attacks Taiwan. And the next year will be decisive. 2024, ladies and gentlemen, will be a decisive year for the next 30, 50 years. We're going to have elections in Taiwan in January. That will definitely moment decisive for Beijing. If Kuomintang wins, Beijing try to attract. If the DPP wins again, the independence route, probably China will attack until 2027, according to the CIA. The 1 century created of the Red Army, Chinese Red Army. We're going to have elections on Moldova, we're going to have elections in Russia and in the US. So 2024, it is a decisive year. It is not a question of money. It is a question of politics, geopolitics.
Thank you. Before I go to the audience for some questions, I want to ask Mr. Öskiper, as the second largest military force within NATO, and as a country that's actively fighting against international terrorism, we heard some complaining remarks by Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu in the opening preliminary this morning, where he criticized the lack of cooperation. How does Turkey see, and how is that tied to NATO's enlargement, the fight against international terror?
Thank you. When you look, I cannot claim I have read every single NATO document ever written, but when I look at the history of NATO committee's engagements, I see that NATO has really dwelt upon terrorism twice in the recent past. One is between 1991 until 94-95, and the second is between 2015 until 2017-18. Apart from those 2-3-year terms, NATO seems to be indifferent to terrorism, what goes on and around its area of responsibility. Simply because in 2001, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and last time in history. That was after a terrorist incident, terrorist attack. And in 2015, again, it was the Turkish delegation in NATO who would claim terrorism must be NATO's business. NATO has a say in terrorism. It's not the first responder, of course, to terrorism, but NATO must contribute to the international efforts to counter terrorism. The other allies didn't really understand why we were saying those things until bombs begin to go off in Paris, in London, Brussels airport, even as close as it gets to NATO headquarters. This is when, all of a sudden, we found it relatively easy to negotiate in committees on what NATO has to do with terrorism. And it lasted 2-3 years. Again, we're finding ourselves in a very difficult position to explain to our allies that if we name terrorism as one of the 2 threats before NATO, there must be something we can do, we must do, more than we are doing now. Again, I stressed this just a second ago. NATO is not the first responder. We do not want NATO, multinational, rotational NATO force to be stationed in north of Syria and fight terrorists. This is not going to happen. It has never happened. What we're after is a solidarity and an understanding that one of the threats from the global south, as you put, is terrorism. And it is not only Turkey's problem, it is everybody else's problem. Thank God, bombs are not going off anywhere these days, but it doesn't mean it will not. They will not. NATO is a defensive alliance, and its core task is to deter and, if necessary, defend. So the whole doctrinal discussion is whether terrorism can be deterred. You cannot always deter a single terrorist who is ready to take his or her own life for a cause, but you can deter its organization, its network, its approach, its expectations. We have done this before. Turkey has single-handedly defeated the PKK terrorists within Turkey. 60, 70, 80, not more than 100 left to the best of our intelligence. But is the PKK over? It's not. It is living elsewhere. So the whole discussion or inference by certain allies, for example, they say that terrorism is only Turkey's problem. It's easy to retort. Who funds the PKK? Turkey? No. Or where do the PKK terrorists reside? Turkey? No, they're elsewhere. Al-Qaeda. So was Al-Qaeda only Afghanistan's problem? Where is the Al-Qaeda, by the way? It's over. Nobody talks about the Al-Qaeda. Is it over? No. So is terrorism tantamount to Daesh or ISIL, however you want to call it, only? No. PKK is as bloody a terrorist as Daesh. Again, which South? We know where the South is geographically, but if you ask a Turkish diplomat what South means, I would say something. If you ask a Spanish diplomat, he or she would say something else. This does not obviate the necessity to tackle each and every challenge that forms the bigger threats emanating from the South. We are, as I said, NATO is an alliance to deter, so we must do what we must to be able to deter terrorism, so that we do not find ourselves in the necessity to defend ourselves from terrorism. Have I answered your question? I can go on, but I don't.
I know.
Thank you.
We can start a debate whose South is bloodier than the others, but let's ask the audience if they have any comments or questions before we conclude our panel. I see some hands. I will ask 3 people to comment, and then I will ask the panel to respond. Here's 1, 2,
Hello.
and the lady there.
My name is Muhammad Yasir Khan, and I'm a lecturer in Bahauddin Zakariya University, Multan, Punjab, Pakistan. I'm pursuing my PhD over here in Istanbul Medeniyet University. So first of all, I really enjoyed the session, and it was really informative. And my question is to Professor Paolo one, like, as I have listened to your talk, you have explained it very well. Like, the USA doesn't have the capability right now. It doesn't have the money to contribute anymore. But when the US had the capability, when the US had money, I guess it has given us today's Iraq, today's Syria, today's Yemen, today's Libya, the uncertain Middle East. And another thing I would, like even Afghanistan, a lot of other things. So today, if the USA doesn't have the capability, it's just saying that we don't have the money anymore and we cannot contribute. And I believe like this Ukraine, the US policymakers would be rather more happy to have the Ukraine as another Afghanistan for the Russians, only to bleed them as they have bled them in Afghanistan. And even this Ukraine is the repercussion of the Cold War, and it will continue what we have done in the history. Thank you.
I saw a lady there. Yes. And then I will ask Commissioner Füle to ask the third question.
First of all, hello. My name is Hazal Naz Yıldız. I'm a student at Üsküdar University. I'm studying political science and international relations. I would like to ask that, as we all know, Turkey's defense industry increasing a very high profile, and I'm pretty sure that it's a very proud moment for us Turks. And of course, this is not a question for Mr. Ambassador and Mr. Öskiper. My question is, what do you think about Turkey's defense industry after the Ukraine war? Because in Ukraine war, we had the chance to show other countries internationally our power in defense industry. So what do you think it will be like for the funding the terror organizations after Ukraine war ends or continue, doesn't matter, because we had the chance to show that our power in defense industry. Do you think it will affect the funds who will funding the terror organizations?
And finally, Commissioner Füle, not many people know he also has served as his country's permanent rep to NATO before becoming the EU minister and then the commissioner in EU. So I have a question for you as well, Stefan. While asking your question, please also share with us if you think the transatlantic security would be stronger if Turkey had joined the EU.
Unprecedented. He's asking me a question.
To allow you to ask a question.
But he warned me.
You know, we negotiated for 5 years, so every time I see you, I feel like bargaining.
Okay, there are two answers. One short, one much longer. The short, yes, it would. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I've always been saying that, working both in NATO, first in NATO and then in the European Union. But I was always making an important remark. That such a contribution would be efficient upon the full membership in the EU, and that would be conditions upon Turkey joining the European Union to look like a little bit different than it is today. And the European Union should look like also at least a little bit different than it is today. By the way, personally, would I prefer the European Union look like a little bit different, to be more open to the countries from the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Turkey? Yes, I would. I've always been. Now I have also questions, but first on the European autonomy. I know that the politicians are pushing us, the security community, into that. Shouldn't we sort of turn it around and use their interest and take it approach rather than from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the up? Shouldn't we, exactly as Professor Schirach was saying about money, saying first, money. Second, integrated European defense industry. Third, a full compatibility when it comes both military equipment and logistic and operations of European defense forces. And fourth, let's turn to the strategic independence as an important part of the strategic autonomy. What I mean, raw materials, chips, and all of that. And then I think everyone could be pleased with the European strategic autonomy. On China, Professor Schirach, I agree with you. I mean, you have been pessimistic on a number of the things, and on China, I'm also afraid that the combination of the current president erasing the checks and balances on one side and not actually doing anything, I would even say almost contrary during the 19th and 20th Congresses, to make the incoming age population crisis and other crises in China unbearable, that the domestic problems might become the cause of some foreign adventurism. But I have a question for you. You're talking about the transatlantic security, and you have focused in your statements on the transatlantic security. But it says also architecture. And in my understanding, the architecture is not only about military and defense. It's much wider. I'm looking at the Eurasian continent. I see three integration projects. I see European Union, I see Eurasian Economic Union, and I see a Belt and Road Initiative, which started as a bilateral project or a project of one country, but it now has a multiple institutions and so on. So it's also a kind of integration project. All three of these integration projects follow their own path when it comes to the regulatory framework. A regulatory framework is something what tells your industries, economy, finances, and so on, what kind of rules, principles, and so on to follow. As far as I can see, all three projects going in a completely different directions. And I'm a little bit afraid that unless we stop and reverse it, we might create the crisis situation where we would need a lot of what you were talking about. But I'm also confident that we prevent this, that we sort of on that basis start to make this regulatory framework more compatible. We might add to this architecture one important non-security element, which would nevertheless has security consequences. Would you please comment on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Well, we have very limited time left, so I will ask each panelist to respond to the questions that they were exposed to in as short period of time as possible. Let's start from left to right.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the gentleman, I think, who spoke first and asked, obviously, pertinent questions. He said, hey, you're talking about America not having the capabilities. But look what America did when it had the capabilities. And I couldn't agree with you more, sir. These were disasters. Afghanistan was a disaster, and Iraq is a compounded disaster because it was completely unprovoked. As the late Zbigniew Brzezinski said, it's a war of choice, not a war of necessity. And it's debatable whether the war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity. What was of necessity was to go after bin Laden, capture him, and bring him to justice. That was the mission in Afghanistan, and it morphed into redoing Afghanistan, which was a complete disaster. After 20 years, look what we have to show for it. So it's true, when America has had capabilities and will, it has not exercised them wisely. Okay, let me just be polite here. It was a disaster. With trillions of dollars expended, thousands of people dead, countries destroyed, Iraq now in the hands of Iran, really great achievement, great success of the American policy to introduce democracy in the Middle East by toppling Saddam Hussein. So clearly mistakes have been made, but tragically a big mistake. That doesn't detract the fact that I said before, and I'll try to be very succinct. I am not suggesting that America is broke and is going to keel over tomorrow. I'm just saying that budgetary constraints also diminish options. And while it's true, and I agree with our Portuguese colleague here, that it is both capabilities and will, if you don't have capabilities, you can have all the will in this world, and it doesn't make any difference. I don't think that Luxembourg can have a global strategic view of force projection simply because it doesn't have the capabilities. They may have the best geopolitical strategists in the world, but they don't have the capabilities. So this is all paradoxical. What I'm trying to say is that capabilities do matter. And the fact that in the aggregate, European NATO countries spend collectively more than Russia doesn't mean a thing. If these capabilities are not interoperable and cannot be integrated in one European defense industry and one European army, the fact that individually Belgium and Portugal and Spain and Italy, whatever, spend this and that and the other, all that money most of it is wasted because it doesn't translate into capabilities. Just one quick footnote. The war in Libya, you remember that. When the European air forces attacked mighty, strategically, overwhelming Libya, after 1 week, the European air forces had run out of ammunition and came begging to Washington and say, hey, can you help us out? Because they could not defeat the Libyan air defenses, all right? This is Europe in action. No expeditionary force, no amphibious capabilities, not much of anything. So, defense budget in terms of the how can I say, the line item mean up to a point. Operational capabilities do matter. And in the case of the United States, I said it before, I'm not going to repeat it. America still has an enormously big army. But it was, I'll conclude with this. President Kennedy, some of you may remember, his inaugural address, January 1961, and I quote almost verbatim, "We shall pay any price, carry any burden, fight any foe, support any friend for the cause of the defense of liberty." Okay? This is something that could be said by the president of a country that controlled about 50% of world GDP at the time. That's not the case anymore. Thank you.
Dr. Pedde.
Well, thank you. Well, general comment on, there is certainly a very pessimistic vision over the ongoing evolution of the international, let's say, stability. And it reminds me the so-called 1979 syndrome, in a certain sense, when in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, the effects of the oil crisis, there was this general idea that the US are gone, that USSR has won the Cold War, that everything is going to change. And in less than 5 years, the world again was completely different. So I don't know where we are now specifically, but I think that still there are a lot of possibilities to recover from the crisis where we are. The model that we represent, I think, is still much more attractive than the model represented by our opponents. There are still a lot of opportunities in areas where we are competing, such as, for example, the Global South, where a strategy of cooperation and an inclusion could provide opportunities which are still unexplored for the West in general. And in the long term, I don't know how sustainable as it could be, the strategy of our opponents. So I'm not that much pessimistic if I look at the long term or the medium term. We are certainly in a very critical phase of our political developments in this moment. Economy is certainly driving much of these pessimistic views, but still there are elements of or opportunities out there which could reinforce the model we represent as NATO and, I suppose, in general.
Thank you. Dr. Öskiper.
Thank you. Following the lead by Herr Füle, I think the title, Recoding the Transatlantic Security Architecture, I don't think we have touched any of those words apart from transatlantic. Let me try to do this by way of conclusion. Architecture, agree with you, Commissioner, it is a broader system of systems, if you will. We have not discussed how the confidence building architecture or disarmament, arms control, non-proliferation architecture is in jeopardy these days. The New START Treaty is not there. The Open Skies Treaty is gone. We can even discuss whether the NPT is going to survive, hearing the Russians planning to, or telling to plan nuclear weapons in a different country. So I think it's up to us to begin contemplating from today what kind of architecture would we wish to have once the war is over. And it's not, again, confined to security and defense issues only. Security, it's, the word security has a positive connotation. It comes from the verb to secure, to be secured. Whereas the Turkish speakers will understand, in Azerbaijan, they call it tehlikesizlik. So being free from danger, being away from danger. I think this is exactly the approach that we must have vis-a-vis security. We will never be secure. There will always be foes. So we must find ways to be as away as possible from those dangers or threats. Transatlantic, we have done this to recode. I don't know if we must recode a new architecture. Recoding means redrafting, rewriting from scratch. I don't think that we will be in a position to rewrite everything that was written starting from 1945. So in a short version, I can suggest to, once the war is over, of course, to keep what is relevant, because some things will remain relevant after the war, to keep them and revise or revisit what needs to be revised. Maybe a sensible way today. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, of course. Thank you.
Dr. Tomé.
3 remarks. First, I agree with Professor von Schirach. Is absolutely sure. But the question still is the following. It's not only a matter of money. We need to spend a lot better. You were mentioning the case of the US. The US is spending less than 50% of the defense budget, less than 50% on personnel. So they have a lot of money to spend on missions, capabilities, research and development still. In Europe, we spend more than 70% only in personnel. How can you pay diesel, operations, headquarters maintenance, and so on? So it's not only a matter of money. What we need is to spend much better to develop capabilities. Not the usual defense capabilities, but for instance, new technologies. That's what China is doing also. Artificial intelligence, for instance. It's not only defense, it is all related, including the new energies, renewable energy. China is also investing a lot. China is not only the largest exporter, it also the largest importer of the world, is the main trading partner of 130 countries in the world, including the EU, since 2020. So we, the US and Europe, need a broad strategy, a political will, how to spend much better than we used to have a goal, to have a strategy, and promote the necessary means, including military and civilian capabilities. The other thing is China. China, I give you the numbers. One of the problems is that China, we cannot underestimate China's impact on European and transatlantic cohesion. Not only because China is a huge trade partner and investor in most European countries, including in the US as well. But there are other reasons. One of the reasons is China is becoming and expanding its military reach to the Atlantic, the Middle East, the North Africa, the Arctic. And the second reason, and most important, that's why I'm talking strategic autonomy from the EU, is that China is by far the EU largest supplier of key raw materials. I'll give you some examples. China alone, according to the European Commission, China alone accounts for 52% of the total amount of imports from the EU of critical materials. China represents 98% of the rare earths consumed by the EU, 93% of magnesium, 69% of wolfram, 66% of scandium. Also, China is controlling the mining sector of other countries from where the EU obtains, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, from the EU obtains 68% of its cobalt. So this trend must be quickly reversed. Otherwise, you're going to be autonomous from the oil and gas from Russia and be dependent on China from key raw materials that are becoming more important than oil and gas. Unfortunately, of course, the EU and US now are working more and more in a cooperative manner to deal with China, but still there are all questions that not gone away, and there is still a huge gap between the two sides of the Atlantic. Just to finish, unlike the US, European leaders do not seem to adhere to decoupling or a neo-containment strategy dealing with China. Unlike the US, the European Union does not have the hard power necessary, nor the political will to compete with China, and European countries and the EU are not in a position geographically, economically, and strategically to do what the US is doing, move away from both China and Russia at the same time. So we need to find something to work together, to promote capabilities, to create common goals, a common strategy, and including involve our partners, whether in NATO, with the EU, or in new cooperative structures, including with our partners from the Asia-Pacific. I prefer Asia-Pacific than Indo-Pacific, but that is another question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for a very stimulating panel. Thank you to the audience for keeping their attention very alive. I want to end with two quotes. I had the pleasure of simultaneously interpreting President Clinton's remarks to Turkish Parliament back in 1999 when he said the next century will be shaped by the decisions made by the Turkish nation. And second quote, which actually responds to many of the questions we addressed today, by President Erdogan of Republic of Turkey. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Have a good afternoon.